Where? Great. Welcome, everyone. Today we're here to discuss the Transit and Active Transportation Project Inventory. My name is Medora Bornhoft, and I work in the Office of Multimodal Planning at the Colorado Department of Transportation. And I'm joined today by Spencer York, Annalise Van Vano, and George Gromke. So Spencer will be presenting with me. Annalise is going to be monitoring our chat, and George is here to answer any transit questions and can also help if there are any technical issues with the Zoom. So let's go ahead to the next slide. So this webinar is all about Senate Bill 25-30. This is a piece of legislation that passed last session. And the main component of this bill is a new requirement for CDOT and also for the metropolitan planning organizations in the state to create an inventory of transit and active transportation projects. The purpose of this inventory is to identify gaps in the transit, bicycle, and pedestrian networks to improve connectivity and safety, reduce emissions, and increase mode choice for people walking, biking, rolling, and taking transit. So you can think of this as sort of a long list of identified project needs that are going to improve mode choice for people traveling around. The scope of this inventory is pretty broad. It can include a funded project and it can include unfunded planned projects. So there's no requirement that the projects already have a funding source identified. Okay. There's also no financial constraint or specific time horizon that the projects need to meet to be included in the inventory. And the inventory is compiled through a coordinated effort between the state, regional entities, and local entities. So one thing I want to make clear is that the statutory requirement is on CDOT to compile an inventory and also on MPOs to compile inventories. For local governments and transit agencies that are located outside of MPO areas, there is no requirement to participate in creating this inventory. It is optional for local governments and transit agencies outside of MPO areas to contribute to this inventory. And the other key point to be aware of is that there is no funding associated with this inventory. So projects that get onto the inventory are not necessarily able to access any more funding because there's no funding tied to the projects on the inventory. So next slide. So some key responsibilities here for the inventory. As I said, metropolitan planning organizations are also required to create inventories. I am going to drop a link into the chat of the interactive web map showing the location of those 5 metropolitan planning organizations across the state. So for agencies that are located within those areas, you work directly with the MPO to submit your projects. There was actually a statutory deadline of December 31st, 2025 for local governments within MPO areas to submit their planned projects to their MPO. So that deadline has passed, and the MPOs are working on compiling their inventories and completing them by a July 1st, 2026 deadline. Now for CDOT, our inventory for the state is focused on state highways and CDOT maintained rights of ways across the state. And the inventory deadline for CDOT is also July 1st, 2026. The approach that we're taking for compiling this inventory is to invite local governments and transit agencies that are located outside of those non-MPO areas to submit their planned projects that impact the state highway network to CDOT, and including projects from existing plans and studies. Next slide. So as we've talked about, the inventory is really focused on expanding access, filling the gaps and identifying where there are gaps in these systems and providing more mode choice. So to that end, the inventory is focused on expansion projects. So within the transit category, there are certain types of projects that can be included in the inventory and other kinds that we're not looking to include. So you see on the left, the project types that can be included in the inventory include things like new transit service, whether that's fixed route or on demand, extended service routes and areas, service enhancement like increased frequency or expanded hours, or a transit facility that supports service expansion. And then on the right is a list of project types that are not included in the inventory. While these are really important types of projects, things like operations and maintenance, maintenance facilities, planning efforts, or data collection, there's no need to include them in the inventory because this inventory, as I said, is focused on expanding access. So next slide. We have a similar breakdown here for the active transportation project types. There's a wide range of projects that can be included in this inventory. Things like new sidewalks, ADA accessible infrastructure, on-street bike facilities, off-street bike facilities, crossing improvements, traffic calming projects. So you can see the full list there. And then on the right are the types of projects that are not being captured as part of this inventory. Again, these are still obviously very important types of projects. But since this inventory has the potential to be so broad, we did want to narrow it down a bit, make it slightly more manageable to capture the needs and fit the statutory purpose of identifying those gaps in the system. So to that end, we are not looking to include wayfinding projects, education or encouragement programs, multimodal plans, data collection, or count programs. So next slide. Now I've mentioned that part of this inventory is pulling together projects that are already in a plan. So we've had this term of a planned project. So this slide explains a little bit more of what we mean by a planned project. It includes any proposed improvement that's specified in a plan or study that reviews transportation needs and guides future investments, infrastructure improvements, or programming. These plans can be authored by a municipality, county, the state, or a regional transportation planning organization. And there's a wide range of plans that can have projects. Obviously, transportation plans, transit plans, but also capital improvement plans, mobility elements of a comprehensive plan, NEPA documents, Pell studies, safety plans, corridor plans. So you can think pretty broadly when looking for where projects may have already been identified in a local, regional, or state plan. Next slide. So on CDOT side, we're taking a close look at existing plans that have been conducted, and pulling out projects that are eligible for inclusion on the inventory. And one of the key set of documents are the recently completed regional transportation plans for the 10 rural transportation planning regions around the state. So those plans have priority listing of projects, and they also have a longer list called the full project list, where projects have been identified. And we've pulled out projects from those long lists that have transit or active transportation elements, and we will be including those in this inventory. I think it's over 300 projects around the state have already been identified through this process. And on the CDOT website for this inventory, you can find the link to those projects that we've pulled out. And Spencer will also be giving a little more information on this, but that's a really great starting place for this inventory and builds off the work that all the TPRs have been doing this last 2 years to update their regional transportation plans. CDOT is also looking at eligible projects from the 10-year plan that's also being in the process of getting updated. The Transit Connections Study, which was just released last year, completed by the Division of Transit and Rail at CDOT. bicycle and pedestrian safety studies for CDOT Region 1 and CDOT Region 4, and NEPA documents and PELs that have been conducted. So we have a wide range of sources to pull from. So looking at the timeline and submission process, CDOT emailed local governments and transit agencies in early February to notify them of this inventory and the requirement that CDOT compile this inventory for the first time, and explained how to submit projects. The deadline for submitting projects for inclusion in CDOT's inventory is April 3rd. And then CDOT will be finalizing that inventory to meet the statutory deadline of July 1st. There is another report CDOT will be creating, and that one is due in October to the legislature's Transportation Legislation Review Committee, or TLRC. And this is a statutory requirement that CDOT create this report about the projects in the inventory and their financial summary, indicating how much it would cost to implement these projects and how much funding is available for those projects. Next slide. So briefly about the update frequency for this inventory. I've mentioned that July 1st is the deadline, so the statute's very clear. We need to complete this inventory for the first time by July 1st. But going forward, the inventory gets wrapped into the planning process, both for CDOT and for MPOs. The inventory gets pulled into the regular planning cycle for our long-range plans. So at CDOT, every 5 years, we update our statewide transportation plan, and the rural transportation planning regions update their regional transportation plans. And so this inventory will be wrapped into that, and there'll be opportunities to update the inventory and add projects onto it in the future. I also wanted to note that projects that get submitted into CDOT's inventory in those rural transportation planning regions, those projects, if they're not already on the long list for that rural TPR's plan, they'll be automatically added onto there. So we have consistency between the regional transportation plan project list and the inventory list. For that report to the Transportation Legislation Review Committee that I mentioned, that summarizes the inventory and gives a financial picture of what the cost is and what the available funding is, that is a one-time report that goes to the TLRC. And the key benefit of this report is to increase awareness of the gaps in the systems across the state and the cost to address those gaps. And next slide, please. I think now we are going to move over to Spencer to give a little more information about the submission process.
Thanks, Medora. So I'm just going to give a really brief overview of how the 2050 regional transportation planning process ties into this, and then I'll be able to walk through the actual submission form and kind of give a better overview of how everybody can submit projects. So for those of you that work closely with your TPRs to submit projects to the long list in the regional transportation plan, the good news is that if the projects you're thinking of that you really want to be in this inventory were already submitted through that, then it's already included. It's already in the list. So I think in that sense, the fact that we're pulling everything over from that long list makes this a really streamlined process. I will say, if there are updates to those projects, or if there are more information on any of those projects that you guys want to provide, there is a rural TPR project list Google Sheet that we've compiled as a part of this process. So it includes all of the transit and active transportation projects. And we ask that if folks have updated information about these projects, that they go into this Google Sheet and they can submit revisions. You just make those edits right into the Google Sheet, and then you can highlight those changes in red. If you don't have access to the Google Sheet, then you can download an Excel file and email that to Medora. Next slide, please. So I'm going to very quickly share my screen and let's see. George, if you can give me that. There we go. All right. So I'm just going to do a very brief walkthrough. Can you all see my screen? Fantastic. So this is the new project submission form. So if the project that you want to include on this inventory is not already on that list as identified through the long-range planning process, then this is the form that you'll be using to submit those new projects. So on this first page here, we have just some basic information about the process, some resources like different maps and things to make sure that folks know what TPR they're in, and some different definitions. We also have some definitions of the actual project types that are allowed and are not allowed. So once you've reviewed these, you can go right into the actual submission form. You can input, you essentially need to input the things in green. We ask that you input all of the things in green as possible. If there's certain things that you just don't know yet, that's fine. Just submit as much as you can. And then for projects that you do have more information available, those columns are highlighted in yellow. So the yellow is optional, the green is required. But things like project name, description, primary project type, and then things like project location, regional corridors impacted, secured funding status, if it is known, and then total amount and sources of secured funding, if it is secured, are required. And then we ask that you identify what plans contain the project. And then we also have some of these optional columns as well, such as project ID, some more descriptive location, and some cost estimates if those are available. All right, we'll stop sharing. And once you do fill out that form, you can email that to Medora Bornhoft at the email below by April 3rd. Next slide, please. So in summary, if the project was already identified through the Rural Transportation Planning Regions Plan, then it's already on the list. If you've looked at the project in that appendix, and you know that there's more information, we ask that you go and add some more detail so that we can have a fully updated project inventory. If it's not on there, you can use that new project submission form to go ahead and submit that project. And for those that have local agencies that might be interested in this, we ask that you spread the word. There's still a full month to go ahead and submit new projects and update any existing projects already in the list there. So we have some links here and some contact information, and I think we can open it up to questions, but I will pass it back to Medora if there's any final comments.
Yeah, I see we have some questions that have been in the chat, but feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself if you want to ask anything else. We're here to take your questions and help address any concerns you have.
I just wanted to clarify, this is just in reference to projects that are on CDOT right of way. Is that correct?
That's right. The inventory is just for projects that are on CDOT right of way. They can also intersect, if it's just intersecting into the right of way, and that is also worth submitting.
And this question might be a little too in detail, but a project like ADA ramp improvement, curb cut, would that qualify as a walkability project?
Yes. So we do include ADA accessibility improvements as a project type that can be included. We recognize that those can be hard to capture all the various ADA improvements that may be needed out there. And in many cases, if you're able to, you can bundle projects and identify that ADA improvements are needed in this, larger area to make it simpler to submit those. And we recognize that it can be a lot of work to identify these projects and get them submitted. So do as much as you're able to do to reflect the needs in your community and get them reflected on the list. Does that help answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
All right. I lost track of who is next.
I think Jerry had his hand up first.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Gary, Chaffey County. I have a question about funding. So I think you mentioned that there's no identified funding for these projects. Was that discussed when they passed the bill? Did they ever anticipate some sort of funding mechanism for these projects?
It's a great question. I was not involved when this bill was passed. My interpretation of the requirement for CDOT to submit a report to the Transportation Legislation Review Committee is that they wanted to understand what is the need out there across the state. What is the available funding and what is the funding gaps to address these transit and active transportation needs? And potentially they could take that information and use that to inform a future funding opportunity. But that's, totally outside the realm of what we know about. It's for the legislature to decide what to do with that information.
Okay, if I could do a quick follow-up. What are the most common funding mechanisms for projects that are in the regional transportation plans? Just a few examples.
That's a great question. There are a lot of different funding opportunities out there. One thing we've seen is that projects that are included into plans are better positioned to apply for grant programs, whether those be state grant programs or federal funding opportunities. Identifying that a project has already been included into a plan puts that project on a leg up compared to a project that hasn't been identified or gone through any kind of process. So we have information on our CDOT website. If maybe Annalise, if you could grab the grants page from CDOT's website and place that in the chat. That's a really good resource to find out about the different grant opportunities that CDOT holds. But there are other opportunities elsewhere through other
And I'll briefly add on to that. So through the TPR prioritization process, there's a lot of projects, a lot of money, a lot of needs that gets identified that needs to be spent toward these projects for them to move forward. In a perfect world, those would all move into the 10-year plan, but realistically, based on CDOT's budget, not everything gets funded that way. A lot of things simply can't. But I think as Medora was saying, and Gary, Tim and I could bring this to St. Louis Valley if you want a better description of this. But in the past, a lot of these projects have moved forward with grant funding and different CDOT funding that is specifically available to those project types.
Great, thank you.
Andrew.
Yeah, Andrew, Archuleta County down here in Pagosa Springs. So my question is just on the list. So if we have projects in mind, I know I've seen them on a list somewhere, but what if I struggle on finding what list that is? Could that be identified once I submit the form, or do I really need that information? Because I'm sure I can find it, but just to throw it out there.
I'm not fully understanding your question, Andrew. So I'm wondering, are you saying that there's a list that you have that you're not sure where it is, or what are you?
No, I'm just wondering, in the form, it says these projects have to be on a state list somewhere already. So can I submit them into the inventory as identified projects without knowing exactly what list that is. I'll have to do some research and find them. I struggled with trying to get any projects on the TPR's list for a number of reasons. So I'm trying to find out what list people are working on and, where this master list hides. I'm kind of new to my position, so it's a lot to keep up on. So
I understand. Okay. So in the project submission form, there is a column that's required. It says, what is the plan that contains this project? And it can be a wide variety of plans. There's no single list that it needs to be on. So it could be your local plan, your capital improvement plan, your comprehensive plan if it talks about mobility needs. And even if the project isn't very specifically narrowly defined as such, but if the needs are identified, you can point to that plan as having identified a need, and that can be your basis for adding the project to the inventory.
all right, I got it. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Joe?
Hi, yeah, thanks. So I know the town of Telluride has two, maybe three projects planned for along 145 spur, but the town owns that right of way. Are those projects that you want to see included on this list, or no, because it's not a state-owned right of way?
Yeah, if there's no intersection with CDOT facility, CDOT highways, or CDOT right-of-way, then there's no nexus for including it on the inventory. If there's any kind of tie-in or connection point, it's still worth adding. But if there's a clear separation, then it wouldn't make sense to add it onto this list.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Okay, Dylan.
I just wanted to clarify the MPO scale of planning because if I remember correctly, it's a bit more in depth. It's all of our major roadways and major bike and pedestrian routes, not just stuff that crosses with CDOT, right?
That's correct. Yeah. We've been talking a lot in this presentation about the CDOT inventory, but for the MPOs, what's required in the statute is to address your regional system, however the MPO defines that to be. So it can be your major roadways, major bicycle corridors, however you define that regional network of significance within the metropolitan planning organization area.
That's what I thought. I just want to make sure. Thank you.
Yes. Thanks, Dylan. Carly.
Hi, I'm Carly with the City of Gunnison. We have some projects lined out in transportation demand kind of master plan that is in draft form right now and won't be adopted before April 3rd. Is that something that we can go ahead and include those projects, or should we hold off until maybe the next round of updates?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would leave that to you of how confident you feel about those projects and whether you want to include them prior to a formal adoption. But as I was saying earlier, we are updating this as our part of our typical planning update cycle, which at CDOT is every 5 years. And so there will be opportunity to add projects into the future. But knowing that we are finalizing the inventory on July 1st, maybe that's a good threshold if you're going to be adopting your plan before July 1st and want to get those projects reflected. You could submit them in advance.
Awesome, thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. As Annalise has said in the chat, we will be making this recording available on our website later if you know of anyone else who wanted to attend today but couldn't. And we also have a lot of resources on our webpage. definitions, the two spreadsheets that Spencer described, and our contact information. If you ever have a question as you're going through this process, feel free to reach out and ask George or myself. We're happy to help answer any questions. Give it another 10 or 20 seconds to see if there are any other questions anyone wants to ask today.
I do have a quick question. This is Gary, Chaffey County again. How will these project lists, will they be somehow incorporated into the transportation planning region project lists? Maybe you've already covered that.
Yes, no, it's a great question. Since we are using those project lists as a basis, and then we're offering this opportunity for other projects to come forward, we do want to go back and update those. So we will be adding in any new projects that we receive back into those TPR plan long lists so that we do have consistency between the inventory and the TPR plans. Because going forward, it'll be an integrated process where updating the inventory will be part of our planning process. So we don't want to, lose track of a project because it's not reflected in that long list for the TPR's RTP.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Well, I really appreciate you all taking time out of your day to join us and asking those great questions. As I said, we're available by email if you want to reach out in the future. But yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Have a great day.